The moment she stepped into the cafe, every conversation seemed to pause. Mud streaked the hem of her dress, dried splashes clung to her shoes, and a faint smell of rain followed her inside. Ethan Blackwood, the man waiting at the corner table, glanced up from his watch, and his expression hardened. This was not what he had expected for a blind date arranged by a mutual friend. Ethan was used to precision. As a self-made millionaire, his world ran on schedules, clean suits, and first impressions that opened doors. He stood halfway from his chair, already preparing a polite excuse. Then he saw her eyes, apologetic, embarrassed, yet strangely calm. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to be late. There was an accident on the road. Someone needed help." Her name was Clara. She explained how she'd stopped when she saw an elderly man stuck in a ditch during the storm, how she'd climbed down without thinking, how the mud had claimed her clothes long before help arrived. She laughed awkwardly, clearly aware of how she looked. Ethan nodded, barely listening. Part of him judged her. Another part, quieter but persistent, felt uneasy with that judgment. When the waiter approached, Ethan surprised them both by ordering tea for two and offering his jacket. "Please," he said, almost stiffly. "You must be freezing." Clara hesitated, then accepted, her hands trembling, not from the cold alone, but from the fear of being dismissed yet again. As she wrapped the jacket around her shoulders, Ethan caught himself wondering what kind of person chose compassion over convenience, and what it said about him that he almost walked away. The cafe slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but something between Ethan and Clara had already shifted. As she warmed her hands around the cup, Clara spoke more freely, as if the mud on her dress had stripped away the need to impress. She told him she worked at a community shelter on the edge of the city, helping families displaced by floods and rising rents. The accident on the road, she admitted, wasn't unusual for her days. "If you wait for the perfect moment to help," she said gently, "someone always gets left behind." Ethan listened, this time truly listening. He had built his fortune in real estate and tech, industries praised for efficiency, not empathy. He donated to charities before, written checks that eased guilt without touching his life. But Clara spoke of names, faces, children who remembered her not for what she gave, but for staying. Halfway through their conversation, Ethan's phone buzzed. A message from his assistant flashed on the screen. "Dinner rescheduled? Investor waiting." Old habits urged him to stand, apologize, and leave. Instead, he turned the phone face down. Clara noticed and smiled, not impressed, just appreciative. Then came the twist that tightened Ethan's chest. Clara mentioned the shelter was at risk of closing. A developer had bought the surrounding land, raising costs and cutting access roads. "We'll figure something out," she said, though her voice betrayed doubt. Ethan felt the weight of recognition. He didn't ask the developer's name. He didn't need to. For the first time, the consequences of his success weren't abstract. They sat across from him, wrapped in his jacket, still smelling faintly of rain. As they stood to leave, Clara thanked him for not walking away. Ethan surprised himself by answering honestly. "I almost did," he said. "I'm glad I didn't." Outside, the clouds began to part. Ethan offered to walk her home, not as a millionaire, not as a savior, but as a man beginning to understand that kindness, once seen, can know. They walked side by side beneath streets still glistening from the rain. Neither spoke for a moment, as if words might disturb something fragile forming between them. Ethan noticed how naturally Clara greeted people along the way, the shop owner sweeping water from his doorway, the bus driver waiting patiently for an elderly woman to cross. She wasn't performing kindness. She lived it. At the entrance of a modest apartment building, Clara stopped. "This is me," she said, handing back his jacket. "Thank you for today." Ethan hesitated, then asked about the shelter again. This time, Clara didn't soften the truth. The land deal would force them out within weeks. Families would scatter. Children would lose the only stability they had left. That night, sleep refused to come. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, Clara's muddy shoes and steady eyes replaying in his mind. For the first time in years, success felt hollow. He opened his laptop and pulled up a familiar file, one of his own development projects. The address matched the shelter's location exactly. The realization hit like a slow ache. He hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But intent didn't erase impact. The next morning, Ethan drove to the shelter unannounced. The building was worn but alive with laughter and movement. Children ran past him, their joy unfiltered. Clara froze when she saw him standing in the doorway, confusion flickering across her face. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said quietly. He confessed everything, his role, his ownership, his ignorance. Clara listened in silence. When he finished, she didn't raise her voice or accuse him. She simply asked, "Can you undo it?" Ethan swallowed. "I can try. And I can do more." Days turned into tense meetings and difficult choices. Investors pushed back. Advisors warned him of losses. For the first time, Ethan chose people over profit. When the shelter received official notice that the project was cancelled, and funding secured for repairs, Clara Br. News of the cancelled project spread quickly, but Ethan avoided the headlines. The praise felt undeserved. What mattered to him now were the quiet changes he witnessed: new windows being installed at the shelter, children sleeping without fear of eviction, volunteers smiling with renewed hope. Ethan began showing up regularly, not with cameras or press, but with rolled-up sleeves. He fixed broken shelves, served meals, and listened. Truly listened. The more time he spent there, the more he realized how little his wealth had taught him about life, and how much Clara's muddy compassion had. One evening, after the shelter had quieted, Clara joined him on the front steps. The city lights flickered in the distance. "I didn't expect to see you again after that day," she admitted. "I didn't expect to stay," Ethan replied. "But it feels right." Their connection deepened slowly, built on shared purpose rather than grand gestures. Clara challenged Ethan when he tried to solve everything with money. Ethan, in turn, helped her see that accepting help wasn't weakness. The true test came when a sudden storm hit weeks later, worse than the one that had covered Clara in mud on their first date. Roads flooded, power went out, and families arrived at the shelter in the middle of the night. Without hesitation, Ethan joined Clara in guiding people inside, carrying children through ankle-deep water. At dawn, exhausted and soaked, Ethan looked around the crowded room. Fear had been replaced with relief. In that moment, he understood what Clara had known all along: kindness wasn't a single act. It was a choice made again and again, especially when it cost something. As the sun rose, Clara smiled at him, the same calm, steady smile from the cafe. "You didn't walk away," she said. Ethan shook his head. "You showed me why I shouldn't." He realized then that the blind date hadn't changed because of mud on a dress, but because of what the mud revealed: character, courage, and a humanity no amount. Months later, the cafe where they first met looked the same: clean floors, warm lights, quiet music. But Ethan was not the same man who once nearly walked away. He sat at the same corner table, smiling as Clara approached. This time, her dress was spotless. Yet to Ethan, she had never looked more beautiful than the day she arrived covered in mud. The shelter behind them had grown into something stronger than before. With community support, not just money, it became a model of care and dignity. Ethan had stepped back from ruthless expansion, choosing projects that built lives, not just profits. Investors questioned him. Some walked away. He let them. What surprised Ethan most was not how much he had given, but how much he had gained. Purpose. Peace. A sense of belonging he had never found in penthouses or boardrooms. That evening, Ethan stood and reached into his pocket, not for a ring or a grand promise, but for a folded piece of paper. It was the original development plan for the land, now stamped permanently protected. He slid it across the table. "This is who I want to be," he said simply. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not because of what he had done, but because of who he had become. She took his hand, grounding and real. No speeches were needed. Outside, rain began to fall lightly. People rushed for cover, but Ethan and Clara walked slowly, unbothered. Mud splashed near the curb, and they laughed together. Ethan paused, looking at her. Funny how everything changed because you stopped to help someone. Clara shook her head. No. Everything changed because you chose not to walk away. As they disappeared into the crowd, one truth lingered: kindness has a quiet power. It doesn't demand attention. It simply waits for someone willing to see past appearances, to choose humanity over judgment. And sometimes, all it takes to change a life is staying when it would be easier to leave.